After 2 months, I return to you with a prayer, this prayer from the end of Psalm 90. May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. There's a train which goes directly from London to Aberdeen in Scotland. It's a beautiful train ride that takes 6 or 7 hours depending where you get off exactly. But for about 20 years now, I've really wanted to see Durham Cathedral. It's described as one of the most beautiful churches in the world and the most beautiful of Britain's cathedrals. So instead of going directly to Scotland, I did a quick stop in Durham. I was just there for a short 3 hours. I dragged my suitcase across town to the Elvet Methodist Church, who kindly agreed to keep my suitcase and my backpack for me while I visited the cathedral. And I extended the greetings of Newton Park to them, and they kindly reciprocated the greetings to us. And so please receive the greetings of the Elvet Methodist Church in Durham to us as a community. The cathedral, which has been around for almost 1,000 years, has, as you might imagine, an intriguing history. And you'll be delighted to know that I'm not going to tell you the whole history today, but I do want to tell you this. Most of what you see today, if you are privileged enough to visit the cathedral, most of what you see today was built in just a short 40 years. It's quite extraordinary when you see all the building that happened and that they did it in just 40 years. And it began, although the dates change, some people say 1081, others say 1093, but somewhere around there. And then other parts of the building were added over the next 150 years or so. But when you stand in the cathedral, in the middle of the cathedral, you're mostly standing in a building which is 1,000 years old. And God's people have worshipped within those walls almost continuously, and I'll explain that in a moment, but almost continuously for all 1,000 years, for all of that time. Between the community of St. Cuthbert, and I mean this with great respect, who were a bunch of monks, a few rich men, which included the bishop of the day, and the community of faith that worshipped in that area, that incredible building was built and paid for. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. Maybe you too would identify with this, but I cannot understand how ancient people with no power tools or machinery, no computers or design software, were able to construct something of such majesty and of such beauty. And for me to be able to stand in it, it literally, for me, it feels like a miracle. It feels like, and this is the point, it feels like God's doing. It feels like only God could inspire and make this happen. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. And then more than just the building, I imagined all the prayers of the saints and the songs and the hymns and the chants and all the people queuing up down that beautiful aisle to receive the sacrament, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, for a millennia, people queuing up to receive the sacrament, and the reading of scripture and all the sermons those walls have heard over 1,000 years. And just the miracle that you can stand in the midst of that. There were, as I hinted earlier, there were times when the social issues of the day stopped people worshipping in the cathedral. For a short while, for example, the cathedral became a prisoner of war camp for Oliver Cromwell. He, at the Battle of Dunbar, he crammed 3,000 weary, defeated Scotsmen into a building designed to accommodate just 1,500 people seated. And so for people to sleep or whatever, it was chaotic, and disease broke out. And 1,700 of those soldiers died within those same walls. The walls built for worship. So the cathedral has had its troubles. It has a checkered history in some parts. And yet it still stands. But the miracle's not so much, even though the building is a miracle. The building is more than the miracle, or the building is more, or the miracle is more than just the building, of course. Because the cathedral today, and wait for it because this blows my mind, the cathedral today holds about 1,400 church services per year. They have daily services of Holy Communion, they have morning and evening prayers, they have weekly prayers for peace and justice, in addition to their usual Sunday services. 1,000 years after it was built, the people of God are worshipping. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. And then I think, with such deep gratitude, it provokes or prompts in me with such deep gratitude of the people who put our own church in this place. I mean, this office that I'm sitting in. A small group of people who decided to buy property in the 1930s and build a small church and a hall. And then only, and it really is, when you think about it, it's like no time, only 20 years later, they then decide to build a bigger church because that little community grew, as well as buying up a few neighboring houses in the meantime, in which I'm sitting in one of those. And then just about, well, it's not perfect, but just about 10 years later, they, after having built that second church, they went and built an even bigger church, which is the building that our congregation meets in now. Which means that this community of faith built 3 churches in 35 years. Imagine 3 churches in 35 years, 3 buildings. And I acknowledge, and so would every member of our church, we would acknowledge that this isn't quite Durham Cathedral. But it's the very same heart, and it's the very same God that inspired the building of Britain's most beautiful church, inspired the building of ours. The very same heart and the very same God. The psalmist prays, and I want you to notice the words with me. We've used them a few times, but notice, may the favor of the Lord our God rest on us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. This is a deeply communal prayer. It's not a personal prayer. This is not for individuals to pray. It's a prayer for a community of faith. It's the language of ours and us. It's not of me and my. It's the language of a community to grow in God. In my time away, I was able to be in 3 places where God's people have worshipped for about 1,000 years or more. And Durham Cathedral was just one of them. And I want to tell you, to stand in those ancient places in which God's people have faithfully worshipped over all these years is a deeply humbling experience. And it reminded me of Jesus' famous words to Peter when he said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That promise has been kept for 2 millennia. And I felt it. I felt it standing in those buildings. I felt the miracle, the wonder of Christian community. I felt the determination of God at work in and through his church, with all its failings, with all its failures. And you know how easy it is to think that what we do when we attend church, when we sit in a building, we can think it's just how ordinary it is. And I want to say it is ordinary, but it's not just ordinary. It is ordinary. It's good that it's ordinary, but it's not just ordinary. Because being a part of the gathered people of God, as ordinary as it is a huge thing. I'm more convinced of it than ever. Because we are delving, when we gather with God's people, we are delving into God's own life. We're delving into God's own heart. We are participating, we are sharing in something about which God feels deeply. He will not give up on his church, and he will not fail her. She may, and she does, stumble and fall. She may flourish or she may fail. Even when those turn a beautiful building into a cruel prison. But at the end of the day, when all is said and done, God will not give up on his church. I know it's kind of popular today for people to slam the church, but God will not give up on his church. And if I may dare to say, neither should we. Neither should we. The martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer reminds us in his beautiful book, Life Together, that Christians are privileged to be in fellowship with one another. Those words struck so deeply in my heart when I read them again in the last few weeks. I want us to hold that word. We are privileged to be able to meet together. He says it is nothing but grace that we are allowed to live in community with fellow Christians. What a wonderful perspective about gathering with God's people. I think so many people think of gathering with God's people as some schlep or some duty. For Bonhoeffer, it's a privilege and it is grace to gather. And I think we need a renewed vision of the worldwide church. I think we need a renewed vision of the local church and of our local church. We need a renewed sense of both the privilege and the spiritual power and the spiritual potential which is present when God's people meet. We need to sense God's heart for a church. We need to sense God's passion for his church. We need to sense his determination, his relentless determination for his church. And we need to be reminded of how much God has done through his gathered people and what he's able to do through his gathered people. And just how determined, I use the word again, how determined God is to accomplish his purposes through his people. Our psalm today says 1,000 years is like one day to the Lord. It's a reminder that for the Lord, these 1,000 years were just a day. And in that day, he has worked deliberately and intentionally to allow his church to grow and to prosper and to succeed despite all its challenges. And if God doesn't find in us those who embrace his heart, he will find it somewhere else. If he doesn't find it in us, he will find it somewhere else, because he won't give up on his church. If Durham Cathedral tells me anything, it's that. God won't give up. He will find a place for his life and his heart to be made known. I've literally only been back at work for a few days, but I already sense in our community some signs of new life. I sense that in the 2 months I've been gone, that God is at work amongst us. I can feel the miracle of Christian community. It's very good to be able to step away. It's very good to allow the community to have to fill in some of the gaps when the minister's away. And I can feel some of the miracle of Christian community. I can sense God's determination for us as a community at Newton Park. For us. I can sense his desire to see us also prosper and move on. And so my simple word today, and it's just a way to be able to find my way back into the community. My simple word for us today is to invite you to pray this prayer regularly on our behalf. For us. Pray this for our church. Pray that God will take whatever it is we do for him, that God will take whatever it is we offer to him, and that he will establish it. He will establish it. He will prosper it. He will grow it. He will add his blessing to it, that he will add his favor to it. Pray it with me. Pray it with me now. May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. And all of God's people said, Amen.